Thank you for coming. I'm Ben Ogilvie. I use she or they pronouns. How many of you are familiar with the idea of culture as an iceberg? Culture as an iceberg. So, no, it's a concept. There are things that are obvious about culture that are easy to see. Language, food, music, art. What are some other things that are like visible aspects of culture can you think of? Bowling.
Clothing.
Oh, clothing. I think bowling could be part of it too. But, sporting events, clothing, definitely.
Skin color.
So skin color I don't see as an aspect of culture. Culture is the sort of artificial things that we've invented. And we in this culture, especially if we're white, we've been taught to believe that if it's true for us, it's true for all of humanity. And it can be a big surprise when we learn that that's not actually true, that a lot of the things that we think are human nature are actually cultural conditioning, cultural standards. I mean, things like love are basic, but how you express it varies dramatically, right? Things that are below the waterline of culture is basically everything you don't think about normally, but that you just take for granted, or you know how to behave in different situations. Standards of behavior, how to interact with infants, with children, courting, elders. Greetings. Gender, yes. Massive below the waterline cultural aspects of gender and race, right? Yes. I had for above the waterline, I had religion and religious observances and rites of passage. And below the waterline, things like how close to get when you're talking with someone, right? Whether to make eye contact or not. In our culture, making eye contact is a courtesy. There are other cultures where it's the height of rudeness, especially from a younger person to an older one. When my mother was scolding me, she used to say, "Look at me!" And then I practiced, I would point my eyes at her, but I would defocus them. And then she would say, "Focus on me!" So the thing about the below the waterline things is we're often not aware of them. I started reading cultural anthropology a couple of years ago to try and make the invisible visible more for me. And, we don't know what we don't know, right? I mean, it's like this is the lens that we're looking through that's hard to see, and until somebody has actually pointed it out, we might have no idea that it's there. So this is especially insidious when it comes to racism because we are taught that racism is obvious and anybody can see it. So if we're not seeing it, it's not there, and there is nothing we need to do. It's nothing to do with us. Of course, it is true that there are manifestations of racism that are obvious, but the reality is that racism is an iceberg too. And of course, it's part of our culture. So this is sort of a subset of the iceberg of culture. It's the iceberg of racism. So there are obvious inequities that are easy to spot, but the unconscious biases, the systemic inequities, and some of them you can just read about. They're easy to learn about. You can read The New Jim Crow and learn how black and brown people get a worse deal, at every step of the way in the so-called criminal justice system. Others are hard to grasp because they involve the way we've been trained in our culture to give white people advantages in darn near everything. And these things have been intentionally designed to be hidden from us because if they were openly unjust, we would reject them. Richard Nixon pushed this along significantly, but even in the 1930s, when Social Security was first being passed, they couldn't get it passed without the vote of the Southern senators, the racist Southern senators. And even in the 1930s, it wasn't okay to just say, well, black people can't have it. And so instead they said, agricultural workers and domestic workers can't have it. And that meant some black people did, and a lot of white people couldn't. That's one of the aspects of racism in our country, is people are out to get black people, and brown people especially, hurt a lot of white people along the way, but they don't notice that or something. So this is not a workshop about racism per se, because that's, I barely have time to make a dent on that, but just being aware of how there are things we don't know, and we bump into them. My friend ChatGPT did this iceberg image for me, because I wanted to have, the usual iceberg picture you see is like this, and I wanted to show things sticking out from it, because that we can run into. But one of the ironies, if that's the right word, about racism is that when we as white people bump into one of these under the waterline aspects of racism, we often don't notice it. It doesn't hurt us in that moment, but it hurts people of color around us. Microsignals are the little messages we send and receive that are subtle, contradictory, or unconscious. Now, they aren't, I'm going to disagree with my slide already, they aren't necessarily contradictory. We could be sending messages in the, overt messages, and the microsignals are in alignment with that, but that's not a problem. That's terrific. So when we need to pay attention and learn is when we're sending one message intentionally and we're unknowingly contradicting it through some other channel. So we're sabotaging ourselves, basically. Microsignals can be intentional or unintentional, conscious or unconscious, positive or negative. And of course, there are macro signals too, the big obvious things that we tend to be aware of those. It's the microsignals we're not. When I was first thinking about this, I Googled microsignals to see what other people had said about it. And there are at least 2 books on microsignals for dogs. If your dog has one ear up and one ear down, what does that mean? That's a signal to other dogs. Ways we send messages or signals. So as individuals, obviously the words that we use are one. What are some others? Expressions. Posture. Tone of voice.
Pictures on the wall.
Pictures on the wall. Yes, so and as a church too, how we're interacting as individuals is part of what we're communicating as a church, but also, the pride flag on the wall. What are some other ways that we communicate as a church? Like overt things. What's
welcoming people?
Welcoming people.
Locked gate.
Locked gate. Website.
The garden.
The garden.
Books in the library.
Books in the library.
Name tags.
Name tags.
How we dress.
How we dress. There's some signs on the toilets that are very meaningful to some people, right? Right. Negative microsignals are often called microaggressions. How many of you are familiar with microaggressions? Almost everybody. Okay, now, please raise your hand if you have a warm, fuzzy relationship with that word. Right. I don't think I've ever been to a workshop on microaggressions that I thought was really successful, and it's partly because just the word gets people's backs up before I even begin. I'm not being aggressive. What are you talking about? And a study of microaggressions is unrelentingly negative It's about what we're doing wrong and how to do it wrong less. Right? Micro signals can be positive as well as negative. That's why I like the term better. Both are important, and let's give ourselves credit for the positives. Positive microsignals are important because they are life-affirming. They signal belonging. They tell us we have a place in the world where we matter. They are beautiful gifts we give one another. We need to understand them so we can do more of them. Negative microsignals are important because they undermine our values and our goals, and they cause harm to individuals. They can cause harm to individuals and to the community. Things we say unknowingly that land on people in hurtful ways, and that say things about our community that we didn't necessarily want to say. Right? We might view ourselves quite differently from that. We need to understand them so we can do less of them. And the fact that we do them unknowingly doesn't make us bad people. It makes us human. At the same time, if we don't care that we're doing them or don't make an effort to do them less, what does that say about us? Right? How a microsignal lands depends on who it's landing on, their entire life experience, their life circumstances, their identities, their inherited historical trauma, all of those things. Just, for example, picture a church visitor card that had a space for husband and wife. Right? Some people would feel right at home with that. They would think, yes, this is a place for me. I'm fit right in, writing our names. I'd be leaving that church so fast, there'd be a vacuum behind me. One of the consequences of this is that there's an asymmetry in the system. Microsignals can seem subtle or completely insignificant to the issuer of them, but painfully obvious to the receiver. They are micro to the sender, but macro to the receiver. Think about microaggressions that, if there's something that somebody's heard 1,000 times, it's like they've been punched in the same place 1,000 times. And so even if what you said just seems like a little tap, it's landing on that big bruise. And intention does matter, especially if you intend to cause harm, but a positive intention in no way guarantees a positive impact, because impact depends entirely on how it lands. The more you know about the receiver, the better your chances are of having a positive impact. The golden rule. Raise your hand if you're familiar with the golden rule. Do unto others as you would have others do unto you. What's the problem with that?
People want
Not the
different
platinum rule.
Right.
People want different things. It works great if the other person wants exactly what you want. So, yes, we need the platinum rule. Treat others the way they want to be treated, which means you need to know something about them. Every demographic group is affected by a unique set of signals, positive and negative. And that's why we can't just say we want to be inclusive and expect to be successful. We need to say who we want to include and then do the work. If we aren't in a particular group, we might have no idea what signals are meaningful to that group. Or we might be able to guess some of them, but not others. So if we want people in a particular group to feel welcome and included, we have to educate ourselves about what matters to them, and then we have to provide it by partnering with group members and changing ourselves and our culture to give welcoming and inclusive signals instead of the opposite. And consultant and life coach Dr. Crystal Jones says there's a world of difference between the generic, all are welcome here, and we created this with you in mind. The book Subtle Acts of Exclusion by Tiffany Jana and Michael Baran is what got me started thinking about Zoom inclusion about 3 years ago. These subtle acts of exclusion, and they're offering this as an alternative to microaggressions, and obviously it hasn't caught on, but they felt like it gave more insight into the concept of microaggressions or negative microsignals. So they've offered these possibilities of what the microsignals might be communicating. You're invisible, you're inadequate, you're not an individual, you don't belong, you're not normal, you're a curiosity, a threat, a burden. So just as an example of this, we had an event a couple weeks ago with the native plant people, and we're chatting in fellowship hall afterwards, and this one woman came up to me and said, "What's your full name?" And I wasn't sure what she meant, but I said, "Well, my last name is Ogilvie, so my full name would be Ben Ogilvie." "No, what did your parents name you?" Now, I've learned not to answer that question, because then they want to call me that, and it's really not their business. So I said, "Why do you ask?" And I don't remember her answer exactly, but the message underneath was, "You've got the wrong name." And I realized that. So I asked if I was the first non-binary person she'd met, and she allowed us how she knew a trans person. We talked about that a little bit, and then I told her about Mr. Barb Grieve, how when he legally became a man, he kept his original name, but he added Mr. to clarify he was a man, and now he's ordained, he's the Reverend Mr. Barb. And that made me seem like not the weirdest person in the world. Now there's two of them, so she wandered off. But two things from this. One is, first of all, it made me realize how sheltered I am in this church, so I want to thank you for that. And I realize this is going to happen if I'm going to be out in the world as Ben, and partly I'm doing it so that people can ask their aggressive, critical questions of me, and then maybe when they meet some young person, they'll be kinder and they'll have more understanding. But which of these SAE types was being illustrated here?
You're not normal.
You're not normal, definitely. Possibly a threat, curiosity, you don't belong. Right, so suppose I was visiting another church with the eye to maybe joining it, and someone greeted me with, "What did your parents name you?"
There'd be a vacuum behind you.
Exactly, there would be a vacuum behind me. Yes, yes. All speech has consequences because all speech sends signals. Everything we do sends a signal, one way or the other. Some of them we intend, some of them we don't. Some of them really are inconsequential, I think, and some of them aren't. We've had controversies in our community over the years about freedom of speech and our right to say whatever we feel like it. Right? The limitation of this point of view is it only considers the speaker and not the listener, the people that the speech is landing on. It doesn't take into account the impact of speech on listeners and consequently on the community. It doesn't signal caring for the listener, only the speaker. The most controversial speech is speech that sends negative signals to particular groups, messages that say, "We don't care about your concerns. You are not important to us." Most of us don't intend to send negative messages. We have good intentions. We all have good intentions. I believe that. But these things land hard. These are messages of exclusion, messages that often seem inconsequential to the speaker and hurtful to the receiver. And one of the interesting things about the way our culture works. And if you're in a dominant group, when just all of us here are in at least one dominant group, the people in the dominant group get to decide what's important and feel entitled to dismiss what people in the marginalized group are saying. So that's one of the things people in marginalized groups struggle with. It's, saying this is hurtful to me, and the person in the dominant group says, don't be so sensitive. I didn't mean it. Political correctness is often framed in terms of offending people. And, people say, well, you have to be ridiculously careful what you say to, for fear of offending somebody. We feel like we can't speak anymore, right? To me, it's not about offending people. It's about whether what we say is oppressive or not, whether it supports injustice and inequities or the opposite, right? If we say we're for justice and equity, and what we say reinforces injustice or inequity, then that is not in alignment with our principles. And to me, that's what political correctness is about. Are we contributing to injustice or inequity? And if so, we need to stop. Otherwise, we're being pretty hypocritical. I'm going to wrap up this part about microsignaling with a poem by my friend Chat. And that picture is a self-portrait that Chat created, this disembodied brain sparkling with ideas. A seat, a smile, a moment shared, microsignals show who's truly cared. What's left unsaid still shapes the room, a subtle chill, a hint of gloom. In every group, there's quiet code that tells us if we're in the fold. Inclusion isn't just a plan, it lives in how we meet each hand. Microsignals, soft and small, can open doors or build a wall.
Wow. Smart friend.
Not the greatest poem ever, but pretty good for a computer. Any questions about microsignaling before I move on? Okay. Some realizations from Zoom inclusion, and I put roomies in there because I was thinking of this in terms of we, what did we learn, but it's always important to ask who the we is. Who is the we? Because especially when you're in the dominant group, it's so easy to think we, and imagine that you're talking about everybody, but really you're picturing the people in the dominant group. So things especially that we roomies learned was that we were hurting people that we cared about because of these subtle acts of exclusion that we didn't realize mattered. If we didn't say every word into a microphone, Zoomies couldn't hear it. If something happened back in the corner and the camera didn't pick it up, Zoomies couldn't hear that. Somebody stands up to introduce themselves. Couldn't see them, couldn't hear them. All right, that's when we started running the microphone around. So these little things, and I think my impression from talking with the Zoomies is nobody was thinking, wow, they're treating us really badly, to heck with this, but some of them were starting to drift away. So we were going to lose some of them if we didn't make a change. And we realize that we are sending messages all the time that tell people whether they are inside or outside our circle of love, our circle of care. So, some more lessons, and especially for members of privileged groups, that inclusion starts with learning and collaborating. So taking responsibility for increasing our awareness and understanding and collaborating because of the basic rule of justice movements in general, and justice and equity is nothing about us without us, right? So I have a couple little stories about this. One is that I was in some national UU Zoom thing, chatting with people. It was about racism, and multiculturalism, anti-racism. And one of the people who lives in a very white city in Pennsylvania said, "We've realized that we need to get some people of color to teach us about racism." And there was a little pause while the rest of us thought, okay, this is a learning moment. What can we say? And someone gently explained that puts quite a large burden on people in the marginalized group to educate the others. And there are many other ways to educate ourselves. You can read books, you can watch videos, etc. Somebody else said, it ended with, if you do bring someone in, make sure that you pay them really well. Right? So there are people of color who choose to educate white people as a job. Right. In the national Zoom inclusion community, thinking about collaborating now, there are a couple people who are roomies, who are very dedicated and energetic, and the problem is they are sure that they have the answers, and they're just plowing ahead doing it. And I've been saying, are you talking with the Zoomies? Have you ever talked with the Zoomie? Have you asked them what they want? No. They know what to do. There are also some Zoomies who are trying desperately to get roomie allies because nobody's listening to them. It takes a team, it takes both. There's a myth about inclusion that it just requires good intentions and a warm smile. I feel like this is a belief that's popular in UU circles. We want to be inclusive and we imagine ourselves as being inclusive, but we haven't done the work that we talked about earlier. Who are we? Who do we want to include, and what would it take for them to actually feel included? So, another set of lessons. Inclusion isn't free. It's not effortless. It takes intention, effort, dedication. It takes a willingness to change, and it takes a willingness to give up some comfort so that someone else can be more comfortable. So you think about it, when there's a privileged group and a marginalized group, the privileged group pretty much has a monopoly on comfort, right? They've got the comfort. And the people in the marginalized group have just learned to deal with it because that's life. So we're just asking the people in the privileged group to give up some, not all, and even out the comfort balance a little bit. But there's another problem, which is people in the privileged group often don't have practice feeling a little bit uncomfortable in that context, and so it feels like this big thing. There's a phenomenon in anti-racism classes that white people will report feeling physically threatened, even though in the room everybody's sitting there quietly, nobody's doing anything the least bit physically threatening. But just that little bit of race-based discomfort that we as white people are not used to seems big. So it seems like a big thing, but if you get it in, get in perspective, where is most of the comfort, maybe that can help it. Inclusion as a spiritual practice. This came up as a topic when I was working with Reverend Makana Morris, who's a retired UU minister in Virginia, who's been very active in Zoom inclusion ministry, and Reverend Renee Rahutsky, who is the co-dean of the Leader Lab on UUA.org. And Renee put the Zoom inclusion ministry startup kit that we have on UUA.org. So UUA.org, if you search for Zoom inclusion, you'll find it right away. And the next project was to do a series of one or more lesson plans for small group ministry around inclusion as a spiritual practice. So just looking ahead to that, the first thing I've come up with is humility. Inclusion requires humility. First, recognizing that we're ignorant in an important area, that there are things we need to learn, and decentering ourselves and centering someone else. Not all the time. I mean, I'm a big believer in taking care of yourself, listening to your body, but once in a while, just to say, in this moment, I am not the most important person here. I am moving myself out of the center, and I'm going to center someone else. And how can I be of service to that person? The next thing is avoiding the shame trap. I just came up with this a couple of days ago, this name. So we are trained in our culture to feel shame when we make a mistake. And if someone points it out to us, either we feel shame or we feel anger that that person we think wants to make us feel shame. But all the time, I mean, that means that it's like there's a mirror in front of me, right? I'm just thinking about myself now and how I'm feeling. I'm feeling shame or I'm feeling anger. So if we could get out of this trap, it would serve us better. And the difference between guilt and shame, guilt says, I made a mistake. Shame says, I am a mistake. That we aren't mistakes. A little guilt is fine because that's our conscience telling us we've messed up and need to do some repair. It helps us focus on the other, the person that we've hurt, and on the necessary repair. Shame makes us focus on ourselves. Here's this mirror in front of my face. Or maybe I'm thinking about you too, if you're responsible, I'm blaming you for how I feel, but the person that I hurt is not in this picture, right? This is especially insidious with racism because the shame that we have been trained to feel about racism keeps us focused on ourselves instead of on doing something about racism. It helps perpetuate racism. There's a story about the Dalai Lama in which people were trying to explain to him how people in Western culture have been taught to feel bad about themselves. And it was such a weird idea to him, he couldn't understand it. He went back and forth with the interpreter, even though his English was really very good, because he couldn't get it. And when he finally did get it, he said, oh, that's just wrong. That shouldn't be that way. So it seems to me, so the question is, how do we get out of the shame trap? And that's to embrace our true nature as shining beings who sometimes make mistakes. I had lunch Friday with Jennifer Coney, who some of you know. She's a past president of the church. She's now a member of the Orthodox Church in Hayward, where she's very happy. And she told me that in the Orthodox faith, when you miss the mark, those are the words they use, when you miss the mark, it doesn't call for shame, it calls for healing. Healing for everyone involved. So ultimately, inclusion is about love. It's about loving ourselves first as shining beings who sometimes make mistakes. And it's about loving others in a way that they experience as loving and feel they belong. So we can't just feel love. It needs to be where they're feeling it. Right? And it's about joy. So this is the platinum rule again. It's not just about us and what we would like. We need to understand as best we can what would feel loving to others and do that. Up here, summary. Okay. We need to learn what's below the waterline. This helps us send more positive messages and cause less harm. 2, that we are shining beings who sometimes make mistakes. And 3, that inclusion is about a humble love that centers others. Get that, Mike.
Could you elaborate a little bit about what you mean by below the waterline?
So in the iceberg of culture, the things that are not visible to us. The part above the water are the things that are obvious. Below the waterline are the things that are not obvious. Maybe we haven't been taught. Maybe we have no idea. It can be in the category of what we don't know. But we can start asking, what is it we don't know that we should? That would be really helpful here to learn. And for each group, suppose we want to be inclusive of people who are deaf or hard of hearing. We can guess some of the things, but we wouldn't be able to guess all of them. One of the pieces on the Leader Lab, the materials was written by a woman who is profoundly deaf at this point. She hasn't always been. And one of the things I didn't know was that a lot of deaf people don't speak English. They speak sign language, American Sign Language, or whatever sign language there is. So captions don't necessarily help them. Or, their English is weak maybe compared with their sign language. So captions help some people a lot, but not everybody. I wouldn't have known that if I hadn't had this conversation with a deaf person. Thank you.